Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. And thank you all for turning out. It's nice to be here. Uh, this is, as you can surmise, something that's taken up the last 3 years of my life. And in researching and writing this book, which, by the way, encompasses a time period of 8 years, it was no small challenge to figure out how to present this to you all, and still having you be conscious when I'm finished. And I did some math the other night and determined that if I were to really do this thoroughly, for an 8-year story, I would have to cover roughly 1 day per second. And if I were to do that, I would already be terribly behind. So what I thought we would do instead of taking this day by day is I want to think of this in terms of addressing two central questions which I'm often asked about this book. And the first is, how is it that the most important house in the United States of America, the symbol of the executive branch, was allowed to deteriorate to the point where it nearly collapsed and killed our president, which is a big question. And the second thing is, second thing I'd like to address is, how did we get the White House that we have today? Because you might not know this, but when you look at the house, yes, you're seeing, a federal era house. But if you were to be fortunate enough to be invited inside, as soon as you step in the front door, you're not in a historical building anymore. You're standing in something that was built in 1950, and that's quite a bit of engineering. And I'm going to try to cover the more interesting parts of it this evening. So to kick this off, every good story in my experience needs a villain. So I'd like to introduce you to one of the villains of my story. This is a 1902 factory photograph of a chandelier built by Caldwell and Company around 1901. It's number 11836, but they had a name for it. They called it the Pendelique, which is lovely. They never weighed it, unfortunately. It was 3.5 feet across and nearly 6 feet tall. My estimates are, given all the bohemian crystal on that thing, it probably weighed around 1,000 pounds. And on a winter afternoon in early 1948, it was hanging here in the Blue Room of the White House. And I'd like you to use your imagination for a moment and try to imagine about 100 women in this room sipping tea. And it's, 1948, so they have their, horn-rimmed glasses on with little jewels in the corner and the mink stoles and everything. And Bess Truman, First Lady Bess Truman, standing directly beneath this chandelier, making small talk, which she couldn't stand. And suddenly, amid all the pleasant chatter, she hears a tinkling sound. And she looks up, and she sees that chandelier start to sway. And at first she tries to ignore it, but the sound gets louder, and she can't. She looks up again, and now it's truly moving. So she summons the assistant usher over, and she says, "Would you please go upstairs and find out what's going on?" Right. The assistant usher's name was J.B. West. Mr. West raced up the stairs to the Oval Study, which is the room directly above this one, and he finds nothing amiss, except for one thing. In the adjoining room, which happens to be the president's bathroom, Harry S. Truman is sloshing around in the bathtub. And I don't believe he was a particularly vigorous bather, but apparently it was enough to get the beam shaking and enough to shake this chandelier. So the guests go home. The Daughters of the American Revolution, no one is harmed. They're given their coats and sent away. And Bess Truman comes upstairs to confront her husband, and she said, "I was afraid that chandelier was going to come down on top of all of those people." And at that, President Truman burst out laughing. He thought that was fantastic. He thought it would be wonderful if the bathtub had slipped through the floor with him in it, wearing nothing other than his reading glasses, and he could come down right in the middle of the Daughters of the American Revolution, as one of his architects later put it delicately in a report, quote, "to descend in the tub among the ladies." But Truman was a practical man, and after he stopped laughing, he said to Usher West, "You'd better get some engineers in here to take a look around." So that's how my book starts, and that's how I've just started. So obviously I'm going to move a little bit faster now. Truman had harbored suspicions about the White House's integrity almost since the point that he moved in 1945 when this picture was taken. He would work in his Oval study late at night, and he was troubled by the sounds that he kept hearing. There were creaking noises, and the curtains would sway on their own even though the windows were closed. At one point in June of 45, he wrote to his wife, "I sit here in this old house and work on foreign affairs, read reports, and work on speeches, all the while listening to the ghosts walk up and down the hallway. The floors pop and the drapes move back and forth." This was the hallway. I've looked. If you see any ghosts, could you talk to me when I'm finished? Over time, Truman had heard so many sounds coming from this hallway that he stopped thinking that ghosts might be the reason for them. At one point, the chandeliers shaking and trembling started to get to be a regular thing, which was very troublesome. And at one point, Truman also borrowed his doctor's stethoscope and walked over to one of the walls, and he pressed the diaphragm against the plaster, and he could hear the house creaking slowly back and forth. This was a 3-story house, not a skyscraper. Shouldn't be making that noise. Finally, one morning, Truman wrote in his diary, quote, "The big fat butler brought me my breakfast, and the floor sagged and moved like a ship at sea." That was a very serious warning sign. The floor wasn't just shimmying, it was truly moving. But we need a last straw, right? So here it comes. As 1948 progressed, the problems, of course, got worse. Not only that Daughters of the American Revolution tea that I told you about, but an incident in June when the family was not home, when Margaret Truman, who is pictured here with her Steinway baby grand piano, and by the way, that baby weighed about 550 pounds, fell through the floor. And now I should be clear that the entire piano did not fall through the floor. One of the legs fell through the floor. But that's enough to tell you that there's a problem with your house. And Margaret said, actually there's some question as to whether it was a spinet that fell through the floor or the grand that fell through the floor. I'm aware that there's a discrepancy. A piano fell through the floor, possibly this one. And Margaret later wrote, "If there was evidence that was needed that the White House was falling apart, it came when my piano in the sitting room broke through the floor." Well, no kidding. Now, Harry Truman hadn't sat idle while all of these spooky things were going on. In February of 1947, he sent out some confidential letters to Douglas Orr of the American Institute of Architects. That's him right there in the glasses. And he also sent another letter to Richard Doherty, who was head of the American Society of Civil Engineers. That's Mr. Doherty right there. And he asked these two to come to the White House and kick around and please keep it a secret. And they did. In fact, these gentlemen and more engineers and architects from the Public Buildings Administration would visit the White House throughout 1947 and into 1948 and inspect the house, and incredibly, word did not get out to the public what they were finding. The truth came out only after Truman was reelected in 1948, but the moment that he was, literally the moment that he, but within a few hours, he was evacuated from the house along with his family. The house was condemned. They were afraid if there were a minor seismic tremor in Washington, the entire house would come in. So why would they evacuate the President of the United States? What on earth had they found? By this time, these gentlemen, by the way, I should mention, had formed into an official body known as the Commission on Renovation of the Executive Mansion. This was the body that would oversee the renovation work. So when I say commission, I'm referring to these gentlemen here. So what did they find when they kicked around? Well, they found this. When they chipped away the plaster covering the interior brick walls, they found cracks, not in the plaster, in the bricks. Some of the cracks were 2 stories tall. It was obvious what was happening to the engineers. The interior brick walls were actually pulling away from the outer stone walls of the White House. In some cases, they had pulled away so far they left gaps big enough for you to put your arm through. The walls were, in fact, sinking into the ground, pulling everything down around them as they went, and it created